So we are on Gimel Amud Aleph 3a. We noted yesterday that there are three specific laws about which Rabbi Yishomel and Rabbi Akiva had the same dispute. And the dispute is the item mentioned in Torah an issue, a voluntary issue, or is it obligatory? Rabbi Yishomel maintained that it's voluntary. Rabbi Akiva maintained it's mandatory. And the three items were, to start with, our law, the Sotah. The question is whether a husband is obligated to warn his wife, or whether it's voluntary. If he feels necessary, he may. That's one dispute. The other dispute was with regard to, which one was it? Oh, a kohen who is not allowed to come in contact with impurity, not allowed to attend the funeral, but the Torah says he may do so for his family, lo yitama. He can become impure for her, referring to his sister. And the question again was, is this obligatory or is this voluntary? Rabbi Akiva says he must go attend the funeral and become impure. Rabbi Yishomel says he may. And then finally, the third dispute was the question of l'olam behen tavoidun. The Torah says that you should keep the non-Jewish slave forever. And the question is this an obligation that he must keep that slave for eternity, and he may not free that slave, or is this voluntary? If he wants to, he may keep her. And the Gemara yesterday, someone suggested that perhaps this dispute as to whether things are obligated or voluntary is not just a dispute in these three cases, but that these three cases are really like poster cases for their universal dispute, which would mean, if that were true, that Rabbi Yishomel would say that any positive commandment where God says do something is actually just a voluntary thing. If you'd like to put on tefillin, you may. Whereas Rabbi Akiva would say it's obligatory. That was a suggested reading. But the Gemara says no. And that's where we are right here. Amar lei. So Amar lei, the one who heard this suggestion, responded to the one who made the suggestion. Right, there's two versions as to who was speaking. It's either a Papa to Abaye or Rabbi Mesharshia to Rava. And either way, the response is done. Hacha b'kroi pli. Here, in these three cases of the Sotah, the kohen becoming impure and the slave, it's a question of how you properly interpret the verses, but it should not be seen as a universal dispute that every time the Torah instructs you to do something, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishomel are disputing as to whether or not it's obligatory or it's voluntary. Rabbi Yishomel agrees that all commandments are obligatory. It's these three cases specifically in which the verse themselves indicate that there might be reason to say it's voluntary. And Rabbi Akiva would say, nonetheless, it's still obligatory. So let's go through one by one. The kines ishtay. Here we have the law of the Sotah, where the Torah says one warns his wife. Rishus, this is voluntary. If he wants to warn his wife, he may. Div Rabbi Yishomel, this is the view of Rabbi Yishomel. Whereas Rabbi Akiva said chayva, it's obligatory. If he sees something nefarious is going on, there's some promiscuity. So Rabbi Akiva maintains that husband is obliged to warn his wife to prevent further promiscuity. Okay, so now let's look at the verses and see why Rabbi Yishomel would say it's voluntary and why Rabbi Akiva still maintains that it's obligatory. So my taima, Rabbi Yishomel, what is the reason for Rabbi Yishomel? Savar law, Rabbi Yishomel maintains ki haytaina, similar to another Tanaic sage, another sage of the Mishnaic era. The Tanya, for we've learned, Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov says, Klape sha'amra Torah like sisna asachicha b'lvavacha. Considering that the Torah says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. So Yachol Kagain Zu, I might have thought that this commandment, this prohibition against maintaining any hatred in one's heart, extends even to this scenario. As Rashi explains it for us, because, where's the Rashi here? A very nice Rashi, so let's see.
Excuse me,
There,
Levi,
yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
your microphone's a bit muddled when you lean forward.
Okay, is this better?
No, I was just commenting that I think there's a.
Is it better now?
Seems so.
Yeah, okay, I'll do this again.
Yeah.
Now it's better? Is it better now?
It seems better, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here's the Rashi. Okay, the Eloik Siv Kraf, the Torah wouldn't say anything. Havamina would have said like this: the Asarhu, it's forbidden to warn his wife. To Amr Bishmal, no, sorry, where is that Rashi I was looking for? Oh, Sheyiris Ishta Yaveres al Das, a person sees his wife transgressing the Das Yehudis, their Jewish religion. She's behaving promiscuously. Nisteres im Shchena, and she's secluding herself with a neighbor. Lo Yikanala, you might think not to warn her, because, as he says here in the previous Rashi, one is forbidden to come into hatred and strife. And certainly, warning his wife, which would cause this whole drama, would cause him to come into a skittle with his wife, with this other person. And therefore, one might have thought that because the Torah says, don't harbor hatred for your brother in your heart, so therefore one might have concluded that I shouldn't even involve myself in when my wife is misbehaving with some other guy, because that's going to cause strife. And the Torah says no strife. Therefore, Talmud Lemar, therefore the Torah says, here, I'm back in the Gemara over here, that if a spirit of jealousy comes in there, the kina is ishta, he may warn his wife. In other words, like this. The reason why Rabbi Yishomel maintains that it is only a voluntary issue, the question of warning his wife is voluntary rather than obligatory, is because when the Torah uses the language, and he warned his wife, it's not an instruction. It's giving you a pass against another prohibition. There's a prohibition of starting any issues of hatred amongst the Jews. This action of warning his wife might actually lead to hatred amongst Jews. And therefore the Torah says, over here you get a pass, because there's an issue of your wife behaving promiscuously, and you want to prevent that. But giving you a pass is not an obligation. So this is how Rabbi Yishomel understands this verse. He's putting it in context. Because ordinarily Torah says no causing issues of strife, therefore when the Torah comes and says you can warn your wife, it's giving you a pass that you're not in violation of the prohibition. But not to say that you actually should go ahead and do it. But if you want to, you may. Okay. Now this is very sound logic. It's very sound logic, right? Contextually speaking, we're trying not to start fights. And Torah is saying, here you may, because there's an issue of your wife of questionable infidelity, or a question of infidelity. There might be. And therefore Torah says, okay, you have a pass. You can get involved in this issue. Very logical. So then why would Rabbi Akiva maintain that it's actually obligatory? Seemingly Rabbi Yishmael's logic is sound. And therefore it says the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva, he agrees with Rabbi Yishmael's logic. The logic is sound. But he says there's an extra verse. The Torah says twice this idea of kino, this idea of jealousy. First it says, a spirit of, Rashi says here, a spirit of jealousy came upon him. The kino is ishtai, and then he warned his wife. So it's a double expression of jealousy, kino. And therefore, says Rabbi Akiva, this extra time that the Torah says, vikine, this extra expression of his jealousy, is to indicate that it's an obligation. In other words, had the Torah only said once, and he warned his wife, vikine is ishtoi, then Rabbi Akiva would agree that this is just giving you a pass, even though ordinarily you're not supposed to get involved in strife. But because the Torah repeats itself, it's because the second time is to tell you, you actually, it's not just a pass, you actually should do this. This is Rabbi Akiva's counter-argument. Now the question becomes, what does Rabbi Yishomel do with the extra time the Torah says to warn her? Right? This is a good point Rabbi Akiva is making. The Torah says twice this idea of vikina, his jealousy. And Rabbi Akiva is arguing that once is to give you a pass, and the second time is to tell you it's obligatory. So what does Rabbi Yishomel do with the second time the Torah says, the kines ishtar, he warns his wife? So Rabbi Yishomel says, I did the boy limnichta nitma. The Torah needs to say twice the scenario of her secluding herself. Why is that? Because the Torah needs to tell us that if she was promiscuous, if she actually was intimate, the law of the Sotah is off. But if she was not intimate, or we don't know that she was intimate, then the law of the Sotah is maintained. So because the Torah needs to repeat itself in order to inform us that even when we don't know about what happened behind those closed doors, nonetheless, she is still forbidden to be with her husband until the moment that she drinks the Sotah, and the Sotah waters verify for us whether she was or wasn't faithful. So there's a chiddush din here. There's a unique law here. Even though we are in doubt as to what she did, nonetheless, she cannot be with her husband. So because the Torah needs to repeat itself to make this law, the Torah repeats the whole scenario and says, he warned his wife. In other words, the fact that the Torah repeats twice, he warned her, is not, as Rabbi Akiva maintained, to tell you that you actually are obligated to warn her, but it's actually only repeated to tell you a different law. Because the Torah needs to repeat the story in order to inform you that even though you don't know what happened behind closed doors, she nonetheless is forbidden to be with her husband. Therefore, the Torah repeats the opening part of the story, which is that he warned her. But you shouldn't derive from here any extra law. Okay, and this is consistent with Rabbi Yishmael's view. Rabbi Yishmael, as is taught in the house of Rabbi Yishmael. For his view is the Tana of Rabbi Yishmael, it's taught in the house of Rabbi Yishmael. Kol parsha shenemra v'nishnis. Any time a passage in Torah is stated and then repeated, shenemra, it's stated v'nishnis and repeated. Loy nishnis, it's only repeated ella, for nothing other than b'shvil davar shenes chadash ba, because of one law that's taught. In other words, Rabbi Yishmael maintains that the Torah will repeat an entire scenario a second time just to inform you of one new law. Rabbi Akiva doesn't like that. Rabbi Akiva, and becomes the root of the argument in all three of the scenarios going forward. Rabbi Akiva is of the view that if the Torah repeats itself, then every word in the repetition must teach you something new. And therefore, in this case, with the law of the Sotah, the Torah repeats the story twice. Once when she misbehaved, and once when we don't know. But when the Torah repeats itself, it also repeats his warning. Then therefore, the warning also has to teach you something. The repetition of the warning. And what does that teach you according to Rabbi Akiva? It teaches you that you're obliged to warn her. Rabbi Yishmael says no. When the Torah repeats itself twice, it's not because each detail in the repetition must teach you something. It could be that the entire repetition is only to teach you one new law. But because the Torah repeats itself to teach you one new law, it'll add all the other details. But not because those other details are there to teach you something new. And therefore, this repetition only teaches you one law. Namely, that even if you don't know what happened behind closed doors, she is still forbidden to be with her husband. But don't derive from there any other new law. Even though the Torah repeats itself and says twice that he warned her. Hope that's somewhat clear. So this is going to be the essential argument, the last line, the punchline of every one of the arguments going forward. In this issue, when the Torah repeats itself, do you have to derive a law from every single detail that it repeats? Or just one law derived from the repetition is good enough to justify the entire repetition? In Rabbi Yishmael's view, one law is good enough to justify the entire repetition. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says no. If it's repeated, then every detail of that repetition must be another law being taught. Okay, I hope that's clear. If it's not, please interrupt me. Okay, so that was case number one that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael disputed as to whether it's voluntary or obligatory. The law of the Sotah, when he warns her, is that an obligation to warn her, as Rabbi Akiva maintains? And the reason he maintains that is because the Torah says twice that he warns her, once to give you a pass against the prohibition of not causing strife. And the second time it's repeated is to tell you that it's an obligation. Whereas Rabbi Yishmael says, no, it's only a pass, and therefore it's voluntary, it's not obligatory. And the fact that the Torah repeats itself is not because it wants to tell you anything new about the law of warning, but it's coming to tell you something new about a different law. The law regarding the fact that even though we don't know what happened behind closed doors, she is still forbidden to be with their husband. And the Torah may repeat itself entirely just to teach you one new law. Okay, so now we come to the second scenario in which the same dispute exists. Namely, and this is what the highlight is, lo yitama. The verse says that a kohen may not defile himself and come in contact with any, become tamei by coming in contact with any dead body, with the exception of his family. And the verse concludes, lo yitama. For her, meaning his sister, he may become impure. So this is rishus. This is voluntary. He doesn't have to go to the funeral, but if he wants to, he may. Give it Rabbi Yishomel. This was the words of Rabbi Yishomel. But Rabbi Akiva says, chayva, it's an obligation. He must go to the funeral. He must become impure and attend the funeral. Okay, so now we have to come to the verses and ask, where is the dispute? So my time with Rabbi Yishomel, what is the reason of Rabbi Yishomel? Why does Rabbi Yishomel maintain that it's only voluntary? He doesn't have to go to the funeral of his family member, but if he wants to, he may. So Rabbi Yishomel is actually rather straightforward. It's the same logic as before. Rabbi Yishomel says the Torah is giving you a pass rather than informing you of an obligation. Namely, I did exiv, considering that the verse reads in the exact same verse, or actually maybe one verse earlier, one or two verses earlier. Let's look on the side over here. Okay, so the verse of Lo Yitama is over here is Vayikra, Leviticus 21:3. And here it's Leviticus 21:1. So it's two verses earlier. Two verses earlier, when the Torah introduces this law that the kohen may not become impure, the Torah says, and Mor ala kohenim, tell the kohenim b'nei Aaron, sons of Aaron, v'amart elehem, and you shall say to them, this is God speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu, lenefesh lo yitama ba'amav, for any soul you shall not become impure amongst your people. So because the Torah begins by saying that the kohen may not become impure, so it's the limit of lo yitama. The Torah must say that you get a pass for your family. So again, it's in context. In the same way Rabbi Yishomel said with the Sotah, that because the Torah ordinarily says you should not cause strife, the Torah has to give you a pass, that you may warn your wife if there's a question of promiscuity, and therefore it's not an obligation, it's only giving you a pass. The same thing's true over here. Torah says the kohen is not allowed to become impure, so the Torah has to give you a pass and say you may if you want to for your family, but don't derive from here any obligation. So for Rabbi Akiva, what does Rabbi Akiva do with this logic? It's very sound logic. Torah says kohen don't become impure, and then Torah says you may become impure by attending the funeral of your family. It seems to be a pass, not an obligation. So that's going to be the same pattern as before. Rabbi Akiva says I have a different verse. The verse in between the two verses we quoted earlier. Read. Here you can see it on the left over here. I don't know if it's clear, but it says it over here. After the Torah says, here you can read these two verses. I don't know if you can see them, 10 and 11, which is it's chapter 21 of Leviticus, verse 1 and 2. So the verse reads, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, God says to Moshe, Emor el kohenim, tell the kohen of b'nei Aaron, sons of Aaron, v'amart elem, and you shall tell them, lenefesh, for a person, lo yitama ba'amav, you should not become impure amongst your people. Okay, prohibition against becoming impure by coming in contact with dead body. Then the verse goes on to say, Ki'im, with the exception of l'sha'eroi, to your family, hakarev, Allah that's close to him, le'imoi, for his mother, la'aviv, to his father, la'vnoi, to his son, la'vitoi, to his daughter, la'achven, to his brother. So right there, the Torah exempts, gives you the pass. And then the verse reads in verse 3 of chapter 21, to his sister, hapsulah, which is not married, which is still a virgin, hakarev, Allah that's close to him, which is never married, lo yitama, for her he may become impure. So now you see again, the Torah repeats itself and given the exemption. First it says, don't become impure, with the exception of your family, your father, mother, son, daughter, brother. And then for your sister, you may become impure. So from the fact that the Torah repeats itself, Rabbi Akiva is in the same line of reasoning. So English, Sheder Nafka, here in the Gemara over here, from the fact that the Torah gives the exemption in the first verse, in verse 2 of chapter 21, that you're allowed to become impure for your family. The pass is already given to you. So lo yitama lamali. Why does the next verse then conclude, for her you may become impure? You already gave me a pass earlier by saying, with the exception of your family. Don't become impure with the exception of your family. So you've already given me the pass. Why repeat yourself and say, for her you shall become impure? Thus it must be l'chayva to tell you it's obligatory. So again, it's the same pattern as before. Rabbi Yishomel says, keep it in context. Torah says, don't become impure, with the exception of your family. It's an exception that's in context and therefore giving you a pass, not an obligation. Where Rabbi Akiva says, but the Torah repeats this pass twice. It says first, don't become impure with the exception of your family, and then concludes, for her you shall become impure. Why repeat that line, for her you shall become impure? You've already given me the pass. Thus it must mean that it's an obligation. Okay, this is a very good question. How does Rabbi Yishomel explain the repetition? Rabbi Yishomel, la mitama ve'ein mitama levara. Rabbi Yishomel says the reason why the verse repeats itself and says, you shall become impure for her, is not to tell you that it's obligatory, but rather to tell you that the only time you get a pass and are allowed to voluntarily become impure by attending for your family member is only if she died and you're going to her funeral. But if, God forbid, one of her limbs was severed, and a severed limb from a human being does confer impurity, for that you cannot become impure. So putting it practically speaking, not for anybody, present company excluded, and God forbid it shouldn't happen to anybody. But if, Rabbi Yishomel is basically saying as follows: if it's a question of a funeral of a family member, then the kohen's allowed to go. Doesn't have to, allowed to. But if it's a question of an amputation, then the brother can't be in the room. Because the only time you get a pass is for her entire body, but not for one part of her body. So Rabbi Yishomel excused the repetition. The repetition of the Torah's pass in allowing you to become impure is not to tell you that you have to become impure, but it's actually to limit the scope of when you're allowed to become impure. You're only allowed to become impure for her, if she or the family member it has passed on. But not if, God forbid, there's a severed limb and she's still alive or he's still alive, the family member is still alive. In that case, you cannot become impure. So now the question becomes for Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, he says the whole thing is voluntary. He says the whole thing is obligatory. And that's why the Torah repeated the exemption. First it says, don't become impure with the exception of your family. And then concludes, for her you shall become impure. The repetition Rabbi Akiva said is because it's to teach you it's an obligation to actually attend the funeral. So now if this verse, this repetition, is there to teach you, in Rabbi Akiva's view, that you actually have to go to the funeral, then how does he know that you cannot become impure when it's a question of a severed limb? So says the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva, how does he derive, because this repetition in Rabbi Akiva's view has to teach you two things. Number one, it has to teach you that you're obliged to go to the funeral. And number two, it has to tell you that the limitation of you becoming impure is only if it's a question of a funeral, not a question of a limb. So that repetition has to have two things to learn from. How so? Because if the Torah was only teaching you one law, it should have said, for her, belishtek, and be quiet. Yitama, become impure. Lamali, why does it have to say that? Shmamin, this teaches you two things. So let's just be clear on this. The verse concludes, for her, you shall become impure. Rabbi Akiva is saying, if all you wanted to tell me was that I can attend the funeral, but I can't become impure for a severed limb, then all you have to say is, for her, period. Why add the word, for her, you shall become impure? There's two words that are added here in this repetition. For her, la, yitama, you should become impure. And because there's two words in this repetition, Rabbi Akiva says it teaches me two things. One is it teaches me that I shouldn't become impure. I can only become impure when it's her funeral rather than if it's a severed limb. And secondly, it's coming to teach me that I actually have to go become impure. I actually have to attend the funeral. And this is because there are two words, la, yitama. For her, you should become impure. So now the question becomes, Rabbi Yishomel, and Rabbi Yishmoel's view, with this repetition is only teaching you one law. Right? In Rabbi Yishmoel's view, the repetition is only teaching you one law. It's only teaching you that, right, the first time the Torah says the exemption that you're allowed to attend the family's funeral is to give you a pass, to give the kohen a pass. The repetition is to tell you that you only have the pass for a funeral, but you don't have the pass for a severed limb. Now, seemingly, this repetition has two words, and the two words are not necessary, and seemingly should teach you two laws. This gets back to Yishmoel's original view. Adi de kosav law, kosav mami yitma. Once the Torah repeats itself, the Torah can repeat the entirety of the thing even if it's only touching you one law. Look at the Tanya Debate Rabbi Yishomel, consistent with that which Rabbi Yishomel teaches. The Tanya Debate Rabbi Yishomel, Rabbi Yishomel teaches, call Parasha Shenem of Nishnas. Anytime the Torah states and repeats a law, Lo Nishnas, it's only repeated Ela B'Shvil Davar Shenes Chadash Ba, only because of one law that's being taught. It's consistent with the previous dispute. And to make this clear again, Rabbi Yishomel maintains that when the Torah repeats itself, it can repeat the entire scenario only to teach you one law. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says every detail of the repetition must teach you something. In this case, of the kohen becoming impure, the Torah says a kohen may not become impure, with the exception of family members. For her, you should become impure. So that last statement, for her, you should become impure, is a repetition. You've already told me with the exception of my family. So why is there a repetition? For Rabbi Akiva, you have to look at every detail of that statement. There's two parts of the statement. For her, you shall become impure. The word for her tells you that the impurity that the kohen is allowed to do for his family member is only if it's a funeral, for her, and not for any severed limb. And then the second word, which says you shall become impure, is to teach you that you're obliged to go to the funeral, because each detail of the repetition in Rabbi Akiva's view must teach you a law. Whereas Rabbi Yishomel says no, the repetition is only there to teach you one law. And the Torah may, and consistent with his view, the Torah may repeat itself entirely, only teach you one law. And what's the one law it's teaching you? The one law it's teaching you is that you only can go to a funeral, but you cannot become impure for a severed limb. But nonetheless, you're still not obliged to go to the funeral. It's only voluntary. Okay, I know this was a little bit of a difficult Gemara to follow, but I hope that was somewhat clear. And if it isn't, please chime in and ask. And God willing, tomorrow we're going to get to the third dispute between Rabbi Yishomel and Rabbi Akiva, whether there's an obligation or voluntary, the question of the slave, and that's going to be even more mind-twisting. So we've got to hold on our thinking caps for one more day, and then the Gemara is going to get to more easy read. Okay. Hope that was clear. If it's not, please interrupt me.
So if she's alive and she's got a severed limb,
Yeah.
does that mean he can't be in contact with her, or he's got to stay 6 feet away like we do with a corpse?
He's allowed to be in contact with her, but not the severed limb.
Yeah.
Okay, she's alive, so she doesn't have any impurity. It's the limb that has impurity. So he couldn't be in the room when she's getting an amputation, let's say. But once that limb has been removed and she's walking around, then certainly they can be together.
And if it goes for an aunt, and if it's an aunt or a close aunt or an uncle or something like that, we can't go
to the operation.
He doesn't say the immediate family; it says to the family.
It does. The Torah lists specifically father, mother, brother, son, daughter, and sister. Those are the ones.
But a kohen can still go to the funeral. I mean, as long as we stay on the path.
Okay, so if you're not on, so if it's a graveside and you're not within 6 feet and there's no covering that you and the grave are under the same covering, then technically you can be there. So by law, you're theoretically not even at the funeral because you're not in contact with the dead body, and it's only if it's graveside. If you're in a chapel and you're under the same roof as a dead body, you couldn't be there. Yeah.
So we could also be in the room where the kohen stay.
Yeah. So in many of the Jewish chapels, they'll have a separate room for the kohen so that you don't share a roof. Yeah.
Okay, so that's clear.
Yeah. Okay, Robert, clear?
Not as. I think I'd like to review that tomorrow.
Okay. Well, we're going to recap it tomorrow, but maybe listen to the recording again. Maybe get some clarity.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Good day.
You too. You too.